Chattanooga without a fight. And September 9th, Bragg has to abandon Chattanooga. This is a major Union accomplishment since the city was of great importance. Chattanooga was a major rail center, important key supply depot for the Confederates. And this means that now, in fact, at least 90% of Tennessee is in Union hands. You've still got some cavalry groups like Forrest and General John Hunt Morgan and some others that are running around causing a little trouble. But for the most part, Tennessee is now in Union hands and it's going to stay in Union hands. All the major cities certainly are Union controlled. Now, Bragg has to retreat into Georgia, as I've already mentioned, and he'd been pushed back more than about 80 miles.
Well, one other thing I want to mention here is that some of these challenges that the Confederacy is facing at this moment has to do with someone who's going to mostly remain in the background for this episode, which is Robert E. Lee. And what we said at the top of this episode, questions about how forces are going to be deployed. Lee was maybe politically weakened a little bit by the Gettysburg defeat, but he wanted to delay Longstreet, the Confederate general, to delay his movement out of the Virginia theater. And here's how this relates to what we're going to talk about here in a second with Chickamauga. So in August, Longstreet is asking the Confederate Secretary of War, and he's pressing Lee also to send his troops west because of everything that's happening out there. So Bragg warns Richmond of a massive offensive by Rosecrans and Burnside and requests reinforcements. So Lee summoned to Richmond on August 24th to discuss the situation in Tennessee and Georgia. And then at the end of August, Davis begins discussing with Lee the possibility of Lee providing reinforcements to Bragg. But Lee argued that Union reinforcements on his front would preclude transfers from his army. But now he's arguing that transfers away from Meade on the Union side that's facing Lee in Virginia, it made Meade's army vulnerable to an offensive by Lee's full army. So that's Robert E. Lee for you, just always thinking of the offensive opportunity. So he even ordered Longstreet to prepare for an offensive on August 31st. So Davis and Lee are, I guess you could say dithering, but the situation is really changing out here in the West. So like you said, Burnside takes Knoxville, and he cuts the rail link between East Tennessee and Virginia, and other critical rail lines and transport lines. Longstreet's two divisions, which didn't begin to leave central Virginia until about September, the second week of September, they had to take the long route to Chattanooga because of these lines being cut off on 10 railroads instead of just traveling a much shorter distance. And each of Longstreet's units took 8 to 10 days to reach Chickamauga, and many of them didn't get there till about the last 2.5 days of battle. So anyway, that's some other things that are happening there in the background on these other fronts. But troop movements, if you love that information, there you go. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
Yeah, it's really difficult for the Confederacy because they in one aspect, they want to send guys out to the West to help General Bragg. It's pretty clear that Meade's not going to do much. But if you weaken Lee's army too much, then you're going to tempt Meade to actually do something in Lincoln, of course. So it's a difficult balancing act. The Confederacy is almost always outnumbered. We've talked about this before. And Lee's a gambler, and Lee is not afraid to put himself in a situation where he's even more outnumbered because of these Union commanders. It's almost as if he can read their minds, and he knows what they're going to do. And he knows that in general, they're just not very aggressive. They're not like him. They're not like Stonewall Jackson or Longstreet. They're cautious. So that enables Lee to roll the dice a little bit and weaken his forces in the hopes of getting an advantage in another part of the battlefield, or in this case, in another part of the whole country. All right, so let's go back out to Bragg's army. He is going to get these reinforcements from Longstreet, as you mentioned, but as you also mentioned, it's going to take forever for them to get there because they have to go this really crazy long way out of the way because of Union control of certain areas and because of railroads being cut. Bragg is south of Chattanooga, as we mentioned, and he deploys his army along a meandering creek called Chickamauga Creek. And supposedly that means River of Death. Now, I do have to say this. It's kind of funny. A couple of the sources that I've been using throughout this series are very skeptical about that.
So
Professor
ominous.
Yeah, it's Chickamauga. Like, it just increases the drama, right? The River of Death. Professor Gary Gallagher, who's at the University of Virginia, he did the teaching company course on the Civil War, which I highly recommend. If you want a really in-depth Civil War course, that's what you want to listen to. But he's very skeptical. He says, I don't really think that's what it means. And Shelby Foote, who of course is departed now, but Shelby Foote wrote one of the definitive works on the Civil War called The Civil War Narrative. And boy, I tell you what, that is thousands and thousands of pages, 3 volumes, each averaging about 1,000 pages. That if you really, really, really want to learn every single thing about the Civil War, pretty much, that's your book. Shelby Foote was also one of the main guests on the Ken Burns miniseries, which I recommend for people who would like to learn the Civil War but don't want to read 3,000 or 4,000 pages. But he says on there, yeah, they said it means River of Death. I think all Indian words mean River of Death. It was kind of funny. But so anyway, we'll see if that turns out to be prophetic or not, that supposed meaning. So Rosecrans is coming south very slowly toward Bragg's army. He thinks the Confederate army, of Tennessee, it was spent. So he spreads out his army over a long arc. But he doesn't realize that Bragg, as we saw, that these divisions under Longstreet are starting to trickle in. He doesn't know that Bragg is actually planning an offensive. So he spreads his army out, which is not real wise. The Union High Command learns about Bragg's attack, but it's too late to send Rosecrans any reinforcements. So Meade is not going to be able to help. Rosecrans is on his own. Bragg is hoping to hit the isolated pieces of Rosecrans' army, and that's going to lead us to the battle itself.
All right, let's jump in. Let's get into the battle.
All right, let's do it. Bragg wanted to move his army around the army of Rosecrans. There's that flanking movement again. That could be another drinking thing.
Yeah,
flanking.
I mean, I'll just say the word Napoleon. So if anyone's sitting there by their hard apple cider and just waiting, there you go, my friend.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's not a movie about this part of the Civil War, so I won't get that word in too much. But anyway, he's trying to flank Rosecrans, get behind the Federals, and in between them and Chattanooga, and that would drive the Federals into a cul-de-sac and encircle them. He thinks maybe he can surround them completely. It's going to be very hard to do. It's pretty risky, but he's going to give it a shot. So on September 18th, there was a little bit of contact between the two armies, really just light skirmishing. But the battle doesn't begin in earnest until September 19th. And one of the first clashes is between our old friend Nathan Bedford Forrest. His cavalry runs into a Union infantry detachment. Both sides send reinforcements and the battle spreads and escalates. This is kind of like the first day of Gettysburg in reverse. At the first day of Gettysburg, it was a Union cavalry unit that ran into a Confederate infantry, and then both sides sent in reinforcements, and it turns in this big battle. But this is just the opposite. We start with Confederate cavalry versus Union infantry, but pretty soon both sides have everything. They've got cavalry, they've got artillery, and they've got infantry. Neither side gains an advantage from this first day. They fight for 12 hours, just back and forth, and neither side gains an advantage. The first day is a tactical draw. Now, we've talked a lot in the past about how prior to some of the battles and during some of the battles, there's been a lot of rain, there's been muddy ground, it's just been a quagmire. This battle is the exact opposite. The ground is extremely dry due to a drought that had occurred, and the entire battlefield is just covered with clouds of dust. This was one of the battles in which it was very, very hard to see. Neither commander could see what the other army was doing, which makes it a challenge. And you had several divisions on the Federal side, and I just want to mention an interesting piece of trivia in passing, that one of the Federal division commanders was a man named Jefferson Davis. How about that? There were 2 Jefferson Davises. This is Jefferson C. Davis. No, I don't think he's related to the Confederate president. But anyway, so General Longstreet arrives that evening, the evening of the 19th. He got lost on the way to Bragg's headquarters. He doesn't arrive until 11 p.m., Bragg puts him in command of half of the army, the right, the Confederate right. And he gives Leonidas Polk, the former Episcopal bishop that we've seen before, he gives Polk command over the other half. And the plan is to hit the Federals all over the line, just to do a complete east to west attack. That evening, the temperature gets down to freezing, but both armies were forbidden to light fires so that they would not give away their position. So these poor men are just freezing, and they're thinking, gee, it'd be nice to have a fire, but they can't. Some people do win anyway, but for the most part, they don't. The next day is September 20th. Bragg orders Polk and Longstreet to attack early in the morning, but as often happens in Civil War battles, it doesn't happen. There's delays for one reason or another. It takes time to get the men up and in the line. There's communication breakdowns. Communication breakdowns? Is that a word? Breaks down? I don't know.
Breakdowns. Yeah, sure, why not?
Breakdowns. Yeah, okay.
It's not uncountable.
What we have here is a failure to communicate. But that's from Cool Hand Luke, by the way. So that is a movie, by the way.
Yeah, I was going to say, so we can reference other movies. Doesn't have to be about this battle.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, whenever there's a good quote, I reserve the right to work it into the narrative here. All right, so the attack occurs late in the late morning, early afternoon. And what happens is a gap develops in the Union line. And this is kind of a crazy story. Rosecrans becomes convinced that there's a gap in the Union line. There wasn't one originally. There was no gap. But in order to correct this gap, he creates a gap in another place. And you never want a gap in your line. Of course, Scott and I have talked about how Civil War tactics worked, how you had these long lines, just big long lines of men, and you've got to keep them filled in. You can't have gaps. Otherwise, somebody will run through, cut you in half, and possibly surround you. So they got to fix this gap. Well, before they're able to fix the gap that was caused by thinking there was a gap, Longstreet, our old buddy Longstreet, he sends troops towards it. They punch a hole right through the line, and the entire right wing, which is about a third of the army, that's the Union right, so that is on the left side of the map. Okay, I didn't do a mental map. Sorry about that, folks, but just think of two east to west lines running from left to right. This is on, if you're visualizing the battlefield, let's say you're looking at it from above, this would be on the left side of the map. This is on the top. The Union is on the top, the north side, the Confederacy is on the south. But anyway, so Rosecrans' entire right wing on the left side, it's about a third of the army. They break and they run. And Rosecrans later said, I saw our lines break and melt away like leaves before the wind. So that's never a good thing. Rosecrans himself retreats. He leaves the battlefield. He just runs off and leaves part of his army there.
Dangerous. I mean, this is going all the way back to antiquity, that many people don't die on the head-to-head clash, but it's when you're routed and fleeing. That's when it happens. And Rosecrans himself,
yes,
he's
very
fleeing.
Dangerous. And Rosecrans makes a huge mistake here. He kind of freaks out and panics. You're supposed to stay with your army, but he doesn't. So Rosecrans and the Union right wing retreat all the way back to the outskirts of Chattanooga. The Federals have 8,000 men captured, 15,000 muskets, 51 cannons, and many other supplies. All these gone. Now they're in Confederate hands. But not every Union general is going to give up. No, sir. We're not throwing in the towel just yet, because the Union left, which is the Confederate right, of course, and that's our right side if we're looking at this battlefield from above. There is a general there that refuses to give up. He is going to stick it out. He's going to stay and fight as long as he can. And his name is George Thomas, General George Thomas. I can't remember if we've mentioned him before, but this is where he's really going to gain his fame. He's been with the Army for quite some time. Thomas rallies the remaining Federals into a strong defensive position. It becomes known as Horseshoe Ridge because of the shape and because it's a little bit elevated ground. And he keeps the Confederates at bay for several hours, even as they're starting to envelop him. He and his army finally realize they got to get out of there, so they retreat back north toward Chattanooga. They retreat in good order. It's not a rout. They retreat slowly, and they, for the most part, maintain their formation. But they go back to Chattanooga, and for this effort, Thomas is given the nickname the Rock of Chickamauga. He becomes a hero in the North, even in the midst of a defeat. The Confederates, sensing their victory, raise a great rebel yell, but Bragg wasn't quite so sure that it was really all that over. It wasn't over, and it wasn't that big of a victory. A Confederate soldier said to him, "Yes, General, we've won a great victory. The Federals are in retreat." Bragg